Well, it's kind of hard to explain, but let me put it this way. I got so many negative comments regarding my Ron Paul video, the video I did entitled "Ron Paul Does Not Speak for Me," or whatever the title was, and there were some, you know, comments on there which are, so ideologically predisposed that you can't even take them seriously to start with. But this said, let's put it this way. Ron Paul is not, you know, I wouldn't consider him a complete kook. I would consider him to be a man who stands on principle. It's just that some of the principles that he agrees with, I don't agree with. That's all. Now, the anti-war stance that he takes, this non-interventionist policy, foreign policy, that we should all be following, is essentially a no-brainer, okay? Because probably, I would guess, 70% of the American public is probably totally behind that. So, yes, we should absolutely end our involvement in foreign wars, okay? But this is, it's not a popular thing in the mainstream media, but it's a very sensible position as far as the American public goes, because most of us are against this to start with. Of course, our views are not aired on the mainstream media or news, so it it becomes irrelevant when we say anything about it. So I completely agree with Ron Paul on that. Some people have suggested that, perhaps the original Tea Party people, the people who were against this huge involvement of federal money in these wars, were somehow also against the banking elite to start with. I'm not really that sure about that. We could come together on certain points, the original, Tea Party people, not the ones who've been taken over already by the Republican Party. And the Republican Party, yeah, that's right. And the Republican Party operatives, the Koch brothers, the super libertarians who have taken over this movement to start with, are now saying that they can align themselves with the Occupy Wall Street movement. And that's all nice and fine as long as our goals remain the same. We may differ in our strategies, okay, but we certainly are not going to support Tea Partiers who support Wall Street, who support the Koch brothers, or anything else. And this is where the difference between, let's say, this nonsensical difference, or rather this sensible difference between, the sensible difference between Ron Paul and, let's say, somebody who voted for Kucinich comes in. Because their economic policy prescriptions are diametrically opposed to each other. So in the economic sphere, there cannot be some sort of a coalition there, because it is from the very start diametrically opposed. We can all agree that corruption needs to be ended. We can all agree on that. So let's do it. But what the Ron Paul people don't understand is that ending the Fed is not the wherewithal or the biggest problem. What we're dealing with is a global financial elite. And it's not just the Fed. We're talking about central banking all over the globe. And so it's not just about the Fed, it's about bankers, the private banking industry and conglomerates coming together to basically screw everyone. That's the bottom line, and I think that's what these Wall Street protests are all about. You can't pin the blame on any one person, particular blame on any one person. Yeah, you know, it is the entire system which is broken. And to rant and rave against government per se, or the Fed per se, is a very naive notion, in my view, because if government was actually representing us, then that equation might be completely different. But what has happened over the last 3 decades is that governments are bought off and paid for by the private banks. And, you know, the Fed is just one example of that, because they're basically run by private bankers. And the rest of us folks, like we say, the 99%, and that white-collar criminals are essentially getting away with a huge amount of fraud. And nobody, nobody's brought to justice, basically. So the last thing that us supporters of Occupy Wall Street want to do is to align ourselves with the same shysters who've been running that whole system to start with. So we should not align ourselves with the Obama administration, with MoveOn.org, or any kind of re-election campaign for the status quo. That is definitely not going to be the answer, because if we do that, we're going to be in the same place once again. Just like these Tea Party idealists, in the very, very nascent beginning of their movement, they started to complain about stuff, and they got co-opted. And God, how easy it is to do that. Especially with a general populace which is very ill-informed, which is propagandized by the mainstream media at every turn. And yes, we can come together on certain points that Ron Paul raises, but not on all points. So the system in the United States, the entire electoral system, is completely broken and fucked up, okay? Basically. We've got big money players playing the cards, dishing them out, and whoever gets the most money is going to get on the nomination scale, and anyone else who thinks in any way differently is not even going to be listened to, including people like Kucinich and Ron Paul. Now, these two figures are diametrically opposed to each other in their economic viewpoint. But, you know, if you have people like that really out there, being able to speak their mind to the public, this whole argument might actually dissipate, you know. I don't think it would, but at least you would have a real opposition in terms of, not in terms of anything, but in terms of a real opposition, you know. You would have opponents, real opponents, instead of fake opponents. And that's all we're getting fed, you know, fake opponents. And the mass media is going to go with the corporate stuff all the way. And so that's why anything sensible can't ever be brought about, because they own the place. They own the place. So what I'm trying to say is, all of you people who are constantly harping and raving against government, you know, government per se, every nation, you know, has some form of government, okay? Government per se is not the problem. The problem is that government is being controlled by big money and big financial interests. And that's what Occupy Wall Street is all about. And some of you people like to blame this on unions. Unions actually have nothing to do with this at all. Unions are completely powerless in the face of globalization, I might add. So they've actually been, you know, co-opted as well, going along with this whole globalist bullshit. If you want to have a truly free market, and this is what many of you are saying, then labor, you know, people that actually work for a living, should be just as able to move freely around as capital is. In other words, open all borders. So if somebody offers me a higher wage, then obviously, you know, a labor or a worker would be interested in, you know, getting a little bit of that. And they could move across that border and say, yeah, we like it. But instead, the exact opposite is happening, because it's all being driven down to the lowest common denominator, which is crony capitalism. And crony capitalism is the worst of the worst, because it exploits people of all kinds, making all sorts of promises until, you know, that country raises up a middle class. And then once that middle class gets too powerful, oh, fuck them. And let's move someplace else. And let's just hire people to work for nothing. That's where it's going to end up. And so this is why I will never support this notion of the free market, because there is no free market unless labor or working people are equally free to move across borders without any restrictions whatsoever. None. So if I want to move into a country or into a nation which pays their workers more, I should be unrestricted to do that. But you see, the free market people, they don't like that. They like free movement of capital. They just don't like free movement of labor. And that's a major flaw in that entire so-called free market theory. Because as long as workers and working people aren't free to move anywhere they like to go, there isn't going to be a free market, period.